The border between the Cathari and Sulvan territories had been burning for 11 days. Not with fire, with threats. With warships holding position just outside the agreed boundary line. Engines hot, weapons charged, waiting for one wrong move from the other side. 11 days of that tension, and in that time, 3 Accord diplomatic teams had tried to intervene. All 3 had failed. The Cathari commander had refused to speak to the first. The Sulvan admiral had ejected the second from his ship. The third team had not even been granted docking clearance. So, they called Daniel Reyes. He arrived on a standard transport. No escort ships, no armed convoy. He came alone, in a vessel so ordinary it barely registered on either side's detection grid. He requested docking with the Cathari flagship first, was granted it within 4 minutes, and walked aboard, carrying nothing but a small data tablet and a thermos of coffee. The Cathari commander, a broad-shouldered creature named Voral, met him at the docking port, with arms crossed and jaw set. Voral had 3 times the mass of a human, and a reputation for ending conversations before they started. He looked at Daniel, the way someone looks at an insect that has wandered into the wrong room. Daniel held out the thermos. "I have been on a transport for 9 hours," he said. "I made too much. You look like someone who also has not slept." Voral stared at him for a long moment. Then he took the thermos. They talked for 2 hours. Daniel did not lecture. He did not present formal accord positions or recite treaty clauses. He asked Voral what he actually needed, not what the Cathari government had officially demanded, but what the commander standing in front of him, responsible for thousands of soldiers, actually needed to feel that his people were safe. Voral told him. Daniel listened without interrupting once. Then he crossed to the Sulvan ship and did the same thing. By the end of the day, both commanders had agreed to a 72-hour stand-down, not because of legal pressure or political maneuvering, but because Daniel Reyes had treated 2 exhausted, frightened commanders like people with real problems that deserved real answers. He had found the 3 specific things each side needed and quietly promised to make sure the accord addressed them within the week. He sent his report to the council that evening. 2 paragraphs, no dramatics. This was not unusual for Daniel. This was Tuesday. He had been doing work like this for 15 years. Peacekeeping missions, back-channel negotiations, conflict mediation, in systems so remote that Accord supply ships took weeks to reach them. He had talked down warlords, sat across from species that considered humans barely worth acknowledging, and found solutions in situations that formal diplomacy had given up on. His record was long and quiet. He did not write memoirs. He did not give speeches. When missions succeeded, other people received the formal credit, and he did not correct them. His human colleagues back on Earth sometimes asked him why he let that happen. He always gave the same answer. "The work got done," he said. "That's enough." The alien soldiers who had served under him had a different perspective. A Velthari staff officer named Tan, who had worked beside Daniel for 4 years on the Eastern Grid missions, once told a colleague that Daniel Reyes was the only commander she had ever served under who remembered the names of every soldier in a joint unit, regardless of species, within the first week. Not because he was performing, because he actually wanted to know. That was what made him different. He was not performing competence. He simply was competent. He was not performing respect. He simply respected the beings around him. In a political body as large and fractured as the Interstellar Accord, where almost everything was performance, Daniel Reyes stood out by doing nothing theatrical at all. He returned to Accord headquarters 3 days after the Cathari-Sulvan stand-down, when both sides had confirmed the terms were holding. He filed his follow-up report, flagged the 3 issues he had promised to raise, and then walked to the main council chamber for the quarterly joint operations review, a meeting he had attended dozens of times. The chamber was large and formally arranged. 47 species held seats. Humanity's seat was near the center, a position that still made some of the older member species quietly uncomfortable. Humans had only been part of the Accord for 30 years. In galactic terms, that was nothing. Many species in that room had been members for centuries, and they had long memories and longer opinions. Daniel sat down and reviewed his notes. He did not notice, at first, that High Diplomat Sarah Vale had positioned herself at the speaker's podium earlier than scheduled. Sarah Vale of the Velthari was not easy to ignore. The Velthari were the Accord's oldest and most influential member species, and Sarah Vale had held her position for 26 years. She was precise, politically sharp, and completely comfortable wielding power in public. She had a talent for turning council sessions into demonstrations of Velthari authority, and most other diplomats had learned to watch her carefully when she stepped to the podium ahead of schedule. She began with routine matters, trade route updates, resource allocation reviews. Then she moved to the peacekeeping operations summary, and that was when Daniel looked up. She was describing the Cathari-Sullivan resolution, his mission. She gave the facts accurately. Stand down achieved, terms confirmed, situation stabilized. Then she paused in a particular way that experienced council members recognized. It was the pause before she said something she had prepared. "We are grateful," she said, "for the function that human personnel continue to serve in field operations. The Accord benefits from having capable instruments available for situations that require a certain kind of presence." Instruments. A few council members shifted in their seats. A Dravani delegate near the back glanced at Daniel and then looked away quickly. Tan, seated in the staff section behind the main floor, went very still. Sarah Vale continued. She had an audience, and she was using it. She spoke about the importance of the Accord's formal diplomatic corps, the trained, credentialed, established teams that represented the institution's real authority. She noted that field personnel, however effective in specific contexts, should not be confused with genuine diplomatic partners. She referenced humanity's short membership history. She used the phrase, "useful in limited roles," twice. She did not say Daniel's name again. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood what she was doing and who she was doing it to. Other council members said nothing. Some were uncomfortable. Some were carefully neutral. A few, from species that had long resented humanity's growing reputation within the Accord, looked quietly satisfied. Daniel's alien comrades, the staff officers and field commanders who had worked beside him for years, sat without speaking. The political weight in the room was too heavy. Sarah Vale was too powerful. No one wanted to be the one who challenged her publicly. Daniel sat straight. His expression did not change. He did not look around the room to see who was reacting. He did not look at Tan. He did not look at Sarah Vale with anger or hurt. He simply listened, all the way to the end. When she finished, and the room settled into the particular quiet that follows a deliberate public act, Daniel stood, calmly, without rushing. He reached up with one hand and unclasped the commander's insignia from his uniform, the Accord's emblem, the one that marked 15 years of service and every mission that had come with it. He walked to the council table. He set the insignia down in front of Sarah Vale's podium. The sound it made when it touched the table was very small. Then he turned and walked to the chamber door. No speech, no accusation, no visible anger. He did not look back. The door closed behind him. The council chamber was silent for a long moment. Sarah Vale looked at the insignia on the table. She looked at the door. Her expression gave nothing away, because she was very good at that. But Tan, sitting in the staff section, watched the door for a long time after Daniel had gone through it. She had served beside him for 4 years. She knew his value better than almost anyone in that room. She looked at the insignia on the table and felt something cold settle in her chest, because she understood something that Sarah Vale, in her political confidence, did not yet understand. Daniel Reyes had not walked out in anger. He had simply decided that he was done. And those two things were very, very different. The chamber found its voice again slowly, the way a room does after something unexpected has happened, and no one quite wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Sarah Vale stepped back from the podium with the same composed expression she had worn throughout. A junior aide approached her and said something quietly. She nodded once and returned her attention to the remaining agenda items, as though the last 5 minutes had been unremarkable. This was a skill she had refined over 26 years, the ability to make a deliberate act look routine, and to move forward so smoothly that questioning her became awkward for everyone else. Most council members followed her lead. Papers were shuffled, screens were tapped, the session continued. But not everyone moved on so easily. Ambassador Drell of the Corvani, a species known for long memories and careful observation, remained very still in his seat. He had been a member of the Accord Council for 19 years, and he had watched power used in many forms. What he had just witnessed was not unusual in method. Sarah Vale had publicly diminished someone to make a political point. This happened. What was unusual was the target, and what was more unusual was the response. He had expected Daniel Reyes to take it the way experienced field officers usually took public political maneuvering. With patience, with a steady face, with the quiet understanding that council chambers had their own rules, and that the best move was usually to absorb the hit and wait. Instead, Daniel had set down his insignia and walked out. No words, no scene, no visible anger. Just a decision, made cleanly, and then acted upon. Drell looked at the insignia still sitting on the table in front of the podium. No one had moved it. He suspected no one wanted to be seen touching it. He thought about what that insignia represented. He had read Daniel's operational file 2 years ago, when the Accord's Internal Review Board had assessed the Eastern Grid peacekeeping program. The file had been long. The list of missions, negotiations, and conflict resolutions attached to Daniel's name had taken him over an hour to read through completely. At the end of it, Drell had noted one particular statistic that stayed with him. Of the 31 situations in the past decade that the Accord's formal diplomatic corps had classified as unresolvable and handed off to field operations, Daniel Reyes had been involved in 24 of them. He had produced a workable outcome in 22. Not all victories, not all perfect, but 22 out of 24 situations that trained diplomats had given up on. Drell looked at the podium. Sarah Vale was speaking again, moving through the next agenda item with her usual precision. He wrote one short note to himself on his personal tablet and closed it. What happened next was not dramatic. Drama would have been easier to manage. What happened next was quiet, and quiet things are harder to contain. The Accord's internal communications network carried no announcement about Daniel's departure. There was no formal statement from the human delegation, no press release, no official notification to field units. The session ended, the council members filed out, and Daniel Reyes was simply not there anymore. But word moved anyway. It always does in places where people have learned to pay attention to what is not being said. By the following morning, staff officers across 3 field commands had heard some version of what happened. The versions varied in detail, but were consistent in the central fact. Commander Reyes had set down his insignia in the council chamber and left. By evening, the story had reached the Eastern Grid units, the border monitoring stations, and the joint training facilities where human and alien personnel worked alongside each other. The reactions were not uniform. In some quarters, particularly among species whose governments had political reasons to support Sarah Vale's position, the response was muted. A few official statements from Velthari-aligned delegations echoed her earlier framing, that human emotional responses to political realities were understandable, but illustrated why humans remained in operational, rather than leadership roles. In other quarters, the reaction was different. 3 senior alien officers, who had served under Daniel on extended missions, sent private messages to the human delegation. Not formal complaints, not political statements, just direct, personal messages, expressing something that diplomatic language struggled to contain. One of them, a Sulvan commander named Vec, who had worked beside Daniel on a 7-month border stabilization mission 4 years ago, wrote 4 sentences. I heard what happened. I am sorry I was not in that room. I would have said something. Tell him that. The human delegation forwarded the message to Daniel. He read it and sent back 2 words. Thank you, Vec. On Earth, Daniel Reyes did not hold a press conference. He did not speak to journalists or give interviews. He submitted his formal resignation from all Accord military and operational roles through the standard administrative channel, the same channel used for routine transfers and equipment requests. He listed no reason beyond personal decision. He requested that all active mission files be transferred to the appropriate Accord departments immediately, so that ongoing operations would not be disrupted. That last part, the careful, professional handoff, was noticed by people who understood what it meant. He was not trying to cause a crisis. He was not using the missions as leverage. He was leaving cleanly, making sure the work was covered, the way a responsible person does when they leave a job. Earth's government did not ask him to reconsider. His resignation was accepted with a formal statement of respect and gratitude, that was genuine and brief. There were no political maneuvers behind it, no quiet pressure, no suggestion that he should go back and smooth things over for the sake of the relationship between humanity and the Accord. Earth's position, delivered through the human delegation in a single short communication to the Accord Council, was simple. Commander Reyes has made his decision. We respect it fully. Privately, several Earth government officials were watching very carefully. They had spent 30 years building humanity's reputation within the Accord through exactly the kind of work Daniel represented: patient, consistent, deeply competent. They understood what Sarah Vale had done and why. They also understood what Daniel's departure meant in practical terms, even if the Accord's leadership did not yet see it clearly. Sarah Vale made one public statement about the resignation. It was brief and carefully worded. She said that the Accord valued all personnel who served its mission, that transitions in field leadership were natural and manageable, and that the institution's strength came from its structures rather than from any individual. She used the word emotional once, placed with precision. The statement was designed to close the topic and move on. It did not work the way she intended, not because anyone challenged it publicly, no one did, but because within 48 hours of Daniel's resignation, the first reports began arriving from the field. A mediation process in the Dravani outer systems, which Daniel had been quietly guiding through back channels for 3 months, had stalled completely. The two parties involved had trusted him personally. They did not trust the Accord diplomat assigned to replace his informal role. They stopped responding to communications. A supply arrangement in the border regions, one Daniel had negotiated informally with a non-member species, using nothing but his reputation as collateral, was suspended. The non-member species sent a short message to the Accord's logistics department. We had an agreement with Reyes. Who are you? A Velthari logistics officer forwarded the message to her superior without comment. Her superior forwarded it upward without comment. It eventually reached a desk close enough to Sarah Vale's office that someone had to make a decision about what to write back. They were still deciding when the third situation emerged. Tan requested a transfer. She submitted it through proper channels, professionally, with no explanation beyond standard career development language. She was a well-regarded staff officer. Her transfer request would not be denied. She had simply decided that she did not want to continue working within the structure that had treated Daniel Reyes as an instrument, and then expressed no visible regret when he left. She did not make a speech about this. She did not send a message to the council. She just filled out the form. But people noticed. People who had worked with her knew what the timing meant. And somewhere in the growing collection of small, quiet problems gathering at the edges of the Accord's operations, another small, quiet thing had been removed from the machinery. It had not broken anything yet. But the gears were beginning to feel the difference. Earth in late autumn had a particular kind of quiet that Daniel had always liked. Not silence exactly. There were birds and wind, and the distant sound of a city living its ordinary life beyond the edge of his small property outside the capital. But it was a different quality of sound than what he had lived inside for 15 years. It was sound that did not require anything from him. No situation to assess, no tension to read, no careful words to choose. Just the world existing around him without needing him to manage it. He slept 9 hours his first night back. He had not done that in years. He woke without an alarm, made coffee the slow way, ground beans, hot water, a few minutes of patience, and stood at his kitchen window looking at the trees. The leaves were going amber and deep red. He stood there for a long time without checking any messages. Then he went for a walk. He had no schedule, no briefings, no communications waiting with a priority flag. For the first time in a very long time, the day had no shape imposed on it from the outside, and he was surprised to discover that this did not make him anxious. It made him feel like he had stepped out of a room where the air was too thin and into air that was simply normal. He walked for 2 hours. He came home. He made food. He read a book, a physical one, paper pages, something he had not done since his early 20s. He did not finish it that day. He did not feel any pressure to. He was, without quite intending it, healing. The Accord was not healing. In the first week after Daniel's departure, the official position remained what Sarah Vale had established. This was a manageable transition. Individual departures did not affect institutional strength. Operations were proceeding normally. This position was maintained with discipline and communicated downward through the appropriate channels. The problem was that the channels themselves were beginning to fill with things that contradicted it. The stalled Dravani mediation was now completely frozen. The replacement diplomat assigned to the process had attempted 4 times to re-establish contact with the two parties. 2 of those attempts received no response at all. One received a polite but firm message, explaining that the parties had agreed to pause negotiations indefinitely. The 4th received something more direct from the senior Dravani negotiator. A message that was forwarded up the chain 3 levels before anyone decided how to respond to it. The message said, "We trusted the man, not the institution. If the institution could not keep the man, why would we trust the institution?" No one had a good answer for that. The supply arrangement with the non-member species in the border regions, the one that Daniel had built on nothing but his personal reputation, did not simply stall. It ended. The non-member species withdrew from the informal arrangement entirely and established a separate trade route with a private commercial consortium instead. The Accord lost access to the arrangement at a moment when 3 of its eastern grid stations depended on it for supplementary resources. Emergency alternatives were found, but they cost more, required formal contracting that took weeks, and created exactly the kind of diplomatic friction that Daniel's informal arrangement had been quietly preventing. The logistics officer who had forwarded the initial message upward, "We had an agreement with Reyes, who are you?" submitted a detailed operational impact report. It was thorough and factual. It listed what had been lost, what it would cost to replace, and what the timeline looked like. At the bottom, she had written one line that was not operationally required, but that she included anyway. This arrangement existed outside formal channels, and therefore did not appear in any standard assessment. There are likely others like it. She was right. There were others like it. The Accord's internal review team, quietly tasked by a senior administrator who had read the logistics report with growing alarm, began the process of mapping everything that Daniel had been managing informally. Back-channel relationships, personal agreements, informal truces held together by trust in a single individual. It was slow work, because none of it was documented in standard systems. It had existed in Daniel's head and in the relationships he had built over 15 years. The picture that emerged over the following 2 weeks was uncomfortable. Ambassador Drell of the Corvani watched the emerging picture with the quiet attention that 19 years of council work had trained him toward. He did not raise the matter publicly. He was patient and he was careful. But he began to keep a private record, not a formal document, just notes, organized by date and operational sector. He had done this before during moments when the Accord was absorbing a cost it had not yet recognized clearly. It was a habit born from watching institutions convince themselves that problems were smaller than they were. He noted the frozen mediation, the lost supply arrangement. The 3 field commanders who had, in the span of 10 days, submitted requests to modify their operational structures, modifications that, on paper, were routine, but that Drell recognized as these commanders, quietly rebuilding around the hole Daniel had left. He also noted what was not happening, which he found equally significant. Tan's transfer had gone through. She was now assigned to a remote monitoring posting, far from the council's political center. 2 other officers who had served closely with Daniel had submitted requests that would take them out of the primary field structure. None of them made statements. None of them caused scenes. They simply redirected themselves, the way people do when something they had organized their professional lives around is no longer present. Drell wrote in his notes, "The people who knew him best are leaving quietly." This is the part Sarah Vale did not calculate. On Earth, Daniel was not watching any of this closely. He was aware of it. The human government kept him informed because they respected him enough to do so, not because they expected him to act on it. He read the updates. He thought about them. Then he put them aside. He had spent 15 years carrying things that were not formally his to carry. He had done it because he cared about the work and about the people involved in it. He had not done it for recognition, and the absence of recognition had not bothered him. But Sarah Vale's words had not simply been an absence of recognition. They had been a deliberate statement about what he was, an instrument, a tool, something used, rather than someone valued. He was not angry. He had moved past anger quickly. the way he moved past most strong emotions, acknowledging them clearly, and then setting them aside when they were no longer useful. What remained was something simpler. He was done. He meant it completely. And in the first weeks at home, nothing he saw in the updates from the Accord made him feel any differently. His neighbor, an older woman named Lena who had lived beside his mostly empty property for 12 years and knew him as the quiet man who was almost never there, saw him in his garden one afternoon and stopped to talk. She asked if he was on leave. "Something like that," he said. "You look better than the last time I saw you," she told him. "You were thinner. You had that look." What look? She thought about it. The look of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and forgotten they are carrying it. He looked at her for a moment. "That's accurate," he said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and continued down the path. Daniel went back to his garden. Sarah Vale made no public adjustment to her position in the third week. But in private, the communications reaching her office had shifted in tone. A council member from the Dravani delegation sent a formal inquiry about the mediation situation. 2 senior Accord administrators submitted joint recommendations for a review of informal diplomatic agreements, phrased carefully, but the implication was clear. And a message arrived from Elder Councillor Mavitt, the oldest serving member of the Accord and someone whose opinion Sarah Vale could not dismiss, requesting a private meeting. She agreed to the meeting. Mavitt arrived without staff and sat across from her without preamble. "How many things was he holding?" Mavitt asked. Sarah Vale began to speak about operational structures and institutional resilience. Mavitt waited until she finished. Then he asked the question again, exactly the same way. "How many things was he holding?" She was quiet. "We do not know yet," she said finally. "The review is ongoing." Mavitt was silent for a moment. He was very old and had seen many things in the Accord's history. Species join and leave, alliances form and fracture, great decisions made for small reasons, and small decisions that changed everything. "You broke something," he said. Not with anger, with the flat clarity of someone stating a fact. "The institution is." "Not the institution," he said. "Something harder to rebuild than an institution." He stood and left, without waiting for her response. Sarah Vale sat in her office after he was gone and looked at the growing list of operational reports on her screen. She did not call anyone. She did not begin drafting a response. For the first time since Daniel Reyes had set his insignia on that table, she was genuinely still. And in that stillness, for the first time, she began to understand the actual size of what she had done. The Accord had excellent systems. This was something its senior leadership repeated often and believed sincerely. Formal protocols for every diplomatic category. Credentialed teams trained in the specific cultural approaches required for each of the 47 member species. Escalation procedures. Conflict classification frameworks. Mediation guides developed over decades of institutional experience. These systems were real, and they were good. No one was pretending otherwise. The problem that the internal review team was now documenting in careful, clinical language, was that Daniel Reyes had not been working inside these systems. He had been working in the spaces between them, in the places where the formal protocols stopped and something more personal was required. And in those spaces, he had built something over 15 years that the systems had never accounted for, and therefore had never thought to protect. The review team lead, a senior Accord administrator named Hess, presented her preliminary findings to a small group of council members in a closed session in the 4th week. She had requested the session herself, which was unusual. Hess was methodical and not inclined toward urgency. The fact that she had requested the session early told the people in that room something before she said a word. She placed a single document on the shared screen, not a summary, a map. A visual representation of every informal arrangement, back-channel relationship, and personal agreement they had been able to identify so far that had been operating within Daniel's network. The room was quiet for a moment. "This is what we have confirmed," she said. "We believe it is incomplete." It was, significantly. What she had confirmed covered 9 active peacekeeping sectors, relationships with 4 non-member species, informal agreements with 11 independent territorial factions, and back-channel communication lines with 6 individuals who were technically adversaries of the Accord, but who had maintained non-hostile postures, specifically because Daniel had personally cultivated relationships with them over years. None of this had appeared in any standard operational report because none of it was standard. It existed in a category the Accord did not have official language for, not contracts, not treaties, not formal diplomatic channels. Just the accumulated weight of a person who had shown up consistently for 15 years, done what he said he would do, and treated everyone he met as someone worth treating with genuine respect. He was not working around our systems, Hess said carefully. He was working in the parts of the operational environment our systems were never designed to reach, the informal spaces, the personal relationship layer. One council member asked what the total exposure was. What would be affected if the entire informal network dissolved? Hess looked at her screen. Based on what we have confirmed, she said, if these relationships are not maintained, we are looking at instability in approximately 40% of our active peacekeeping sectors within the next 6 months. Not immediate conflict, but the conditions that allow conflict to develop. The room was quiet again. And the personal relationships themselves, another council member said. Can we replicate them with other personnel? Hess was quiet for a moment. She was a careful administrator, and she chose her words precisely. Relationships of this kind are built over time, through consistent behavior, and they attach to individuals rather than to institutions, she said. We cannot transfer them. We would need to rebuild them. That process would take years, and it would require personnel who are capable of the kind of consistent, genuine engagement that created them in the first place. She did not say personnel like Daniel Reyes. She did not need to. The Ganari Compact, a loose alliance of 4 species in the outer systems, sent a formal communication to the Accord in the 5th week. The Ganari Compact had been on the edge of Accord membership for 3 years. Daniel had been the primary point of contact for their integration discussions. Not officially, because the formal negotiating team handled the official process, but in practice, because the Ganari leadership had developed trust in him specifically, and had consistently preferred to work through him on the sensitive questions. The formal process was a framework. Daniel was the relationship. The communication from the Ganari Compact was polite and professionally worded. It informed the Accord that the Compact was choosing to pause membership discussions indefinitely and would communicate further when circumstances permitted a productive resumption. When the Human Delegations Translation Team reviewed the original language, not the diplomatic Accord standard version but the literal Ganari phrasing, one sentence in the middle of the document did not translate smoothly into the polished version. The literal phrasing said, "The person we spoke to is no longer speaking. We will wait." The translator included a footnote explaining the cultural context. In Ganari communication, this phrasing was not an insult or a complaint. It was simply a statement of reality. They had been in relationship with a specific person. That person was gone. They would wait to see what came next before investing further. The formal diplomatic team assigned to Ganari relations spent 3 weeks trying to restart the conversation. They were professional and well prepared. They followed the protocols. They used the correct cultural forms. The Ganari responded politely to every communication and said nothing of substance. On Earth, Daniel was building a bookshelf. Not metaphorically. An actual bookshelf, from wood, in the spare room of his house that had been empty since he bought the property 8 years ago and spent almost no time in. He had found the plans online one afternoon, bought the materials, and spent several evenings learning the process. He made mistakes. He corrected them. He was not trying to build the perfect shelf. He was trying to build something with his hands, and to think about nothing else while he did it. It was working. His brother, Marco, visited during this period, and found him in the spare room, with sawdust on his clothes, and a measuring tape in his hand. Marco was a teacher, and had a comfortable talent for understanding people. He sat on the floor, and watched Daniel work for a while, without saying anything unnecessary. Eventually Marco asked, "Are you okay?" Daniel thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "I think I actually am." Marco looked at him for a moment. "You don't seem angry." "I was, briefly," Daniel said. "I'm not now." "What are you now?" Daniel set down the measuring tape and looked at the shelf taking shape against the wall. "Clear," he said. Marco nodded. He understood what that meant, even if he did not press it. Daniel had spent 15 years inside something enormous and demanding. Being clear was not a small thing. Back at the Accord, the council member who had originally asked about replicating Daniel's relationships found himself returning to Hess's briefing document often in the following days. He was a practical man named Councillor Veth, from a species that valued precision above almost everything else. He did not deal well in abstraction. He wanted to understand the mechanism, how one person had come to hold so much weight without anyone noticing. He requested access to Daniel's full operational files. He read them over 4 days, carefully, the way you read something when you are looking for a specific answer. He found it, or something close to it, in a series of field reports from Daniel's early career, reports from his first assignments, before he had any significant reputation, when he was a junior human officer in a galaxy that did not think much of humans. In every report, in every situation he had been assigned to, Daniel had done the same things. He had learned the specific cultural protocols of the species he was working with before he arrived. He had listened before speaking. He had followed through on every commitment he made, no matter how small. He had remembered details that the people around him had told him weeks or months earlier, and referred to them in ways that communicated clearly. I was paying attention. You matter enough for me to remember. He had done this with everyone, not just with the powerful people or the politically important ones, with junior officers, with logistics staff, with the warlord's aide-de-camp whose name no one else bothered to learn, with the Cathari commander's second-in-command, who stood quietly in the background during Daniel's first meeting with Voral, and who, 3 years later, became the Cathari delegation's lead negotiator, and who, when that happened, sent Daniel a private message, remembering the exact thing Daniel had said to him during that first brief interaction. Veth read that message in the file. Then he sat back in his chair for a long time. The mechanism was not complicated. It was just rare. Daniel had treated every person he encountered as someone worth treating well, and in a galaxy full of political calculation, that had made him unforgettable. Not because he was performing, but because he was not. Veth wrote a short summary and sent it to Councillor Drell, who read it and added one line before sending it on to 2 other council members he trusted. This is what Sarah Vale called an instrument. The Eastern Grid Peacekeeping Program, which Daniel had been managing as the senior coordinating presence for 7 years, held together structurally but began experiencing a specific kind of deterioration that the formal reports described as communication delays and coordination friction. Translated out of administrative language, what was happening was that the commanders in the field trusted each other less without Daniel as the common trusted presence. He had been, without being formally assigned the role, the person through whom difficult conversations between different species commanders were channeled. Not because of his rank, there were higher-ranking people in the structure, but because everyone in the program had learned over years that Daniel would be honest, fair, and consistent. When disagreements arose, people brought them to him. He was not an arbitrator by title. He was one by trust. Without him, the difficult conversations did not disappear. They just happened, without the person everyone trusted, and they went worse. 3 coordination meetings in the 5th and 6th weeks ended, without resolution on issues that, in Hess's assessment, Daniel would likely have resolved in a single direct conversation. She added this to her documentation. The list was long now, and growing. By the 7th week, the Accord could no longer describe the situation as a manageable transition. It still did, in its official communications. Official communications have their own momentum, and the people who write them are trained in the particular discipline of maintaining composure in language, even when the operational reality does not support it. Transitions are always manageable in official communications. Situations are always being monitored. The institution's strength always comes from its structures. But the structures were showing stress in ways that were becoming difficult to absorb quietly. The Dravani Outer Systems mediation, which had stalled in the 3rd week and gone silent in the 4th, collapsed completely in the 7th. The 2 parties, a Dravani Territorial Council and a coalition of independent freight operators, had been 30 days from a working agreement when Daniel left. They were now 30 days into open conflict, with 3 freight vessels impounded and a Dravani border station operating in closed status. The formal Accord mediation team had been formally withdrawn after the 4th failed contact attempt. The situation was reclassified from active mediation to monitoring status, which was the administrative way of saying, "We are watching it get worse, and we are not currently able to stop it." The conflict did not threaten Accord security directly, but it blocked a trade corridor that 6 member species used regularly, and the commercial disruption was producing its own set of political friction points. Small problems had a way of becoming large ones when they sat in the same place long enough. Councillor Veth added it to the list he had been keeping alongside Drell's. The withdrawal was larger. The Sereth sovereignty, a species that had been a peripheral member of the Accord for 40 years, sent formal notification in the 8th week that it was withdrawing from active participation in Accord security agreements. Not full withdrawal from membership, not a dramatic exit, just a careful, legal, fully documented decision to remove themselves from the security cooperation framework that bound member species to collective defense and peacekeeping obligations. The reasons given in the formal notification were listed under administrative headings and used the kind of language that makes things difficult to argue against directly. Resource limitations, internal prioritization, a desire to review the terms of participation before recommitting. None of these reasons were invented. They were all real factors in the Sereth sovereignty's decision-making. But there was another factor that did not appear in the formal notification, because it was not the kind of thing that appears in formal notifications. For 6 years, Daniel Reyes had maintained a specific relationship with the Sereth sovereignty's senior military liaison. A careful, consistent relationship built on a series of small commitments he had kept so reliably that the liaison had come to regard him as the Accord's most trustworthy face. When border questions arose, when Sereth military movements created tension with neighboring systems, when the formal Accord channels moved too slowly, the liaison had communicated with Daniel directly, and they had found practical solutions. The liaison had heard what happened in the council chamber. She had not commented publicly. But in the weeks that followed, the Accord's communication with the Sereth sovereignty had cooled by degrees, so gradual that no single data point triggered alarm. By the time the formal withdrawal notification arrived, the cooling had been going on for 2 months. When Hess added the Sereth situation to her documentation, she wrote one sentence that was more direct than her usual language. This withdrawal is connected to the loss of the informal relationship with the Sereth liaison. The formal process did not cause it, and the formal process cannot fix it. Sarah Vale came under pressure for the first time from within the Velthari delegation itself. It came from Delegate Hovar, a senior member of the Velthari political structure, who had watched the accumulating situation with the careful attention of someone who understood that political decisions have operational consequences, and that the consequences eventually find their way back to the decision-maker. The conversation between them was private and conducted with full professional courtesy, but it was direct. Hovar told her that 3 Velthari commercial interests were being affected by the trade corridor disruption in the Dravani sector. He told her that Velthari intelligence had flagged the Sereth withdrawal as a potential precedent that 2 other peripheral member species were watching closely. He told her that the mood in several allied delegations had shifted in ways that were subtle but real. He did not tell her she had made a mistake. He was too experienced for direct language of that kind. He simply laid out the picture with precision and then waited. Sarah Vale listened. She was not comfortable, but she did not show discomfort. "The situation is being managed," she said. Hovar looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who has heard that phrase many times in his career, and understands exactly what it means and does not mean. "Sarah," he said, using her name without the title, which was unusual and intentional. "We are watching the thing you broke." He left. She sat alone in her office for a long time afterward. The decision to send a junior envoy to Earth was made in the 9th week. It was framed internally as a routine diplomatic communication, categorized in the records as an outreach regarding personnel transitions and operational continuity. The envoy chosen was a young Accord administrator named Sel, competent and presentable, selected specifically because sending anyone more senior would signal more urgency than the official framing could support. Sel traveled to Earth and met with Daniel at a government liaison building in the capital, a neutral, formal setting that Sel had requested, perhaps expecting a formal meeting. Daniel had agreed to the location without complaint. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Sel presented the Accord's position with care, that Daniel's contributions were valued, that the transition period had created some operational complexities, that the council would welcome a conversation about potential re-engagement in a capacity that reflected his experience and expertise. The language was prepared and professional. Sel delivered it well. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. When Sel finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many missions have collapsed?" he asked, not accusingly. "Just asking for information." Sel hesitated, then gave an honest count of the situations that had formally deteriorated. Daniel nodded. "Are they offering reinstatement at the same rank and role?" he asked. Sel hesitated again. The honest answer was that the council had discussed this, but had not reached a formal offer. What was being offered was a conversation about re-engagement. The distinction mattered. "A conversation," he said. Daniel nodded again. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate the trip. Please tell the council that I wish the operations teams well." Sel waited, understanding that this was a decline, but wanting to be certain. "Is there anything you would want me to bring back to the council?" Sel asked. Daniel thought about it. "No," he said. He stood, shook Sel's hand, and walked him to the door. Sel filed his report that evening. It was honest and thorough. He noted Daniel's demeanor. Calm, not hostile, not bitter, not performing resolution. He noted the absence of any demands or conditions. He noted that Daniel had not asked for anything, had not hinted at what would bring him back, had not signaled any opening. He ended the report with a personal observation that he almost removed before filing, but kept because he thought accuracy required it. Commander Reyes did not appear to be waiting for anything. He appeared to have genuinely moved on. If the council believes this situation can be resolved through formal negotiation, I think they need to understand that there may not be terms on the table that match what is actually preventing his return. Several people read that final paragraph carefully. Among them was Elder Counselor Mavitt, who read it twice, and then sent a very short private message to Sarah Vale. The message said, "It will need to be you." Sarah Vale read the message. She put her screen down. She looked at the window of her office, which faced the formal gardens of the Accord's headquarters complex. Orderly, maintained, geometrically precise. She had always found them calming. They did not calm her now. She thought about what Mavitt's message meant and the specific weight it carried. She thought about what Sel's report had described, a man who was not angry, not waiting, not negotiating, a man who had simply left and then proceeded to live his life without apparent pain or strategic patience. She thought about the junior envoy she had sent and the outcome and the cost of having sent him. She thought about the insignia on the table. She had been very good, for many years, at making political decisions that served large strategic purposes and accepting the costs of those decisions as necessary. She was capable of regret in an abstract sense, the recognition that a price had been higher than anticipated, but she was not accustomed to the specific and personal kind of reckoning that Mavet's message was pointing her toward. It would need to be her. Not another envoy. Not a formal offer through channels. Her, personally, without the armor of institutional representation or political cover. She was not sure she knew how to do that. She sat with that uncertainty for a long time. It was unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory, for a person like Sarah Vale, required careful preparation. She began to prepare. She told no one in the council that she was going. This was a significant departure from how Sarah Vale operated. She was an institutional creature. Everything she did was documented, authorized, and conducted within a framework of formal representation. She had staff who managed her communications, aides who prepared her for every meeting, and a political structure around her at all times that gave weight and authority to her actions. She left all of that behind. She booked passage on an Accord diplomatic transport without using her title, or rather, she used it to authorize the travel, but listed the purpose as a personal diplomatic outreach rather than an official council mission. This distinction meant that she was going as Sarah Vale, an individual, rather than as the Accord's most senior Velthari diplomat. She had full legal standing to make this distinction. She had never made it before. Her chief aide, a careful woman named Oreen, who had worked beside her for 11 years, noticed the travel authorization and came to her office. "Should I prepare briefing materials?" Oreen asked. "No," Sarah Vale said. Oreen waited a moment. "Staff?" "No." Oreen looked at her. In 11 years, she had never seen Sarah Vale go anywhere significant without staff. "Sarah," she said carefully, "do you know what you are going to say?" Sarah Vale looked at her. It was a simple question, and she did not have a simple answer, which was itself unusual. "I know what I need to find out," she said finally. Orion nodded and left without further questions. She was good at reading the moments when Sarah Vale needed space. Earth in late autumn was colder than Sarah Vale had expected. She had been to Earth twice before, both times for formal council visits with full diplomatic protocols, official receptions, climate-controlled meeting facilities, the kind of environment that insulated visitors from the texture of the place they were actually in. This time she had arranged a government liaison vehicle and a single human diplomatic contact to handle the practical logistics, and she stepped off the transport into actual autumn air for the first time. She found it sharp and honest. She did not dislike it. Daniel lived 40 minutes outside the capital. The drive took her through roads lined with trees going amber and gold, in ways that she did not have a cultural reference for, but that struck her as extraordinarily beautiful, in a completely unornamented way. She had not told Daniel she was coming. She had considered sending advance notice, and decided against it, because she understood, with some precision, that advance notice would give him the opportunity to prepare a response, and she did not want a prepared response. She wanted whatever the moment produced when she appeared at his door without warning. She did not think he would refuse to speak with her. She was less certain what he would actually say. He opened the door and looked at her without surprise, which surprised her. "Diplomat Vale," he said. "Sarah," she said, "not officially." He considered this for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The house was modest and comfortable, and had the particular character of a place that someone had recently decided to actually inhabit, rather than simply store belongings in. There were books on a partly built shelf in what looked like a spare room. There were dishes in the drying rack beside the sink. There was a jacket thrown over a chair, with the ease of someone who had stopped maintaining a space for appearances. Daniel made coffee. He did not ask if she wanted any. He simply made it and put a cup on the table in front of her when they sat down. She wrapped her hands around it because the morning was cold and the gesture was warm, and she was, without quite having planned to be, simply a person in another person's kitchen. She had brought nothing. No prepared arguments, no official offers. She had told herself this was intentional, that arriving empty-handed was the right approach. Sitting here now, she understood more fully what that meant. She had come without armor. "I have no official purpose in being here," she said. He nodded. "The situations in the field," she began, and then stopped herself. She had almost begun with the operational problems, the most familiar ground, the place where she could talk about systems and structures and problems that had solutions. She caught herself and set that aside. "I came because I wanted to tell you something myself," she said, "not through a message, and not through an envoy." He was quiet. He was very good at being quiet, in a way that was not hostile or pressuring, just patient. She had noticed this before, professionally. It was more affecting up close. "I prepared what I was going to say," she said, "on the transport. I had arguments. I had context to offer, the political dynamics, the pressures I was managing from several factions that were resistant to human influence expanding. I had an explanation." "I'm not sure I want the explanation," Daniel said, not unkindly, evenly. "I know," she said. "I know that. That is what I understood on the transport. The explanation is for me, not for you." She set down her coffee cup. "I said things in that chamber that I knew were incorrect," she said. "Not politically incorrect, factually incorrect. I knew your record. I know what you have done in the field. I know what the Eastern Grid looks like with you managing it. And I know what it looks like now without you, and I knew enough to anticipate the difference." She paused. "I said what I said because it was useful in the moment, and because I calculated that you would absorb it the way you absorb everything, quietly, and that the political benefit would outweigh the cost." The kitchen was very quiet. "I miscalculated the cost," she said, "but that is not the same as saying I was wrong to make the calculation. It means I made it badly." She looked at him. "That is not an apology," she said. "I wanted to be honest with you about the difference." Daniel was quiet for a moment. I appreciate the honesty, he said. He set down his own cup. He looked at her steadily. One question, he said. She waited. Did you believe what you said? The question was simple and specific, and she had not anticipated it, which meant her preparation gave her nothing to use. She sat with it. He did not push. He just waited. She thought about the words she had used in the chamber. Useful instrument. Tools, not partners, cheap to spend. She had chosen each of them with care. Political language always required care in selection. But the question was not whether she had chosen them carefully. The question was whether she had believed them. The silence went on for a long moment. No, she said quietly. He nodded. He did not say anything after that. He did not offer comfort, and he did not press the advantage. He simply let her answer exist in the room. After a moment he stood and picked up both coffee cups and set them in the sink. She watched him do this. He moved through his own kitchen, with the ease of someone who had found the rhythm of ordinary life and was not performing it. You came to retrieve a tool, he said, not looking at her. His voice was not angry. It was matter of fact. To find out what it would take to bring it back. She did not deny it. He turned around. You met a person, he said. She held his gaze. I know, she said. He walked her to the door without ceremony. At the threshold, she turned back to him. Is there anything the Accord can do? She asked. He thought about it. Genuinely, she could see that. He was not dismissing the question. You'll know when you know the answer, he said. She was not sure what that meant, but she understood from his expression that he was not going to explain further, and that the explanation was something she would need to find on her own. She walked down the path to the waiting vehicle. She did not look back. But she stood outside the vehicle for a moment before opening the door, in the cold autumn air, and looked at the house and the trees and the ordinary quiet of a person's actual life. She thought about the word she had used, instrument. She thought about the man in that kitchen. And she felt the full weight of the gap between those two things in a way she had not allowed herself to feel before. She got in the vehicle and sat with it, all the way back to the transport, in silence, without preparing anything at all. The council session was scheduled as a routine quarterly review, which meant it was broadcast on the Accord's standard public channel to member species diplomatic feeds. Most such sessions were unremarkable enough that the public feeds carried them without much attention from anyone beyond the professional diplomatic class. Senior staff watched. Journalists who covered Accord affairs watched. Occasionally, when something significant was expected, the viewership expanded. This session had not been announced as significant. There was no advance notice that anything unusual would occur. The agenda was standard, and Sarah Vale had not told her staff what she intended to do until the morning of the session, when she called Oreen into her office and told her directly. Oreen listened without interrupting. When Sarah Vale finished, Oreen was quiet for a moment. You understand what this will cost you politically, she said. Yes, Sarah Vale said. The factions that supported your position in that session, the ones who benefited from the framing you used, will take this as a repudiation. Yes. Oreen looked at her for a long moment. Is there anything you want me to prepare? She asked. No, Sarah Vale said. I'm going in without notes. She stepped to the podium at the beginning of the session, before the agenda items were introduced. This was irregular, and it caused a stir in the chamber. Small movements, exchanged glances, the particular attentiveness of experienced council members who have learned to notice when something is off schedule. She did not explain why she was speaking before the agenda. She simply began. She did not use the passive voice or the careful language of political correction. She did not frame what she was doing as a clarification or a contextual update or a revised position following a review of available information. She stood at the podium in front of 47 species representatives, and she said, in plain language, that she had made a public statement in this chamber, approximately 10 weeks ago, about Commander Daniel Reyes and about human personnel serving in the Accord, and that the statement had been factually wrong and deliberately misleading, and that she had known it was both of those things when she said it. She said his name. She said it clearly. She stated specifically what she had said, and specifically why it was wrong. She said that Commander Reyes had served this Accord with 15 years of work, that had protected lives, preserved agreements, and built relationships that the Accord had relied upon without ever formally acknowledging. She said that calling him an instrument had been a political act designed to diminish a person whose value she privately understood very well, and that doing so had been wrong. Not wrong because of the consequences, but wrong because a person who has earned honest recognition deserves to receive it. She paused. "I am making this statement on the record," she said, "not as a diplomatic gesture and not as a step in a negotiation, because this council chamber is where I said what I said, and this is where the correction belongs." She stepped back from the podium. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then the session continued. The broadcast went to every member species' diplomatic feed, as scheduled. On Earth, Daniel was in his kitchen when the alert came through from the Human Government Liaison Office, a standard notification that an Accord public broadcast had been flagged for his attention. He almost ignored it. He had been ignoring most Accord communications for weeks, not out of bitterness but simply because they no longer belonged to his life in the same way. But he opened it. He watched Sarah Vale at the podium. He watched the chamber. He watched her step back when she was done. He sat at his kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated in any way that felt good or satisfying. What he felt was something simpler, a kind of recognition, not for himself. For the act itself, it had cost her something real, and she had done it anyway, and she had done it without conditions and without using it as a tool for something else. He understood, looking at that broadcast, that she had not done it to bring him back. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and made a call. Not to the Accord, to Earth's government. He spoke with the senior diplomatic minister for an hour, the longest official conversation he had engaged in since his resignation. He was direct and clear about what he wanted, and about what he would not accept. He would not return as a field operative under Accord command. He would not return to the same structure, with the same informal understandings, and the same absence of formal recognition. He had thought about this during his months at home, and he knew it clearly, not as a demand, but as a simple statement of what was true. He had carried enormous weight for 15 years, and he had done it without asking for acknowledgement. He would not do that again in the same way, not because of pride, but because he understood now that the informal structure had allowed the Accord to treat him as something unofficial, and that informal status had made Sarah Vale's words possible in the first place. He wanted to return as Earth's formal diplomatic representative. Full standing, title equal to the most senior diplomats in the chamber. Clear authority, clearly documented. The minister did not pause. "Yes," she said. "We agree. We have been waiting to offer this for 2 years. We did not want to push you before you were ready." He was quiet. "Why?" he asked. "Because we didn't want you to do it for us," she said. "We wanted you to do it because you chose it." The Accord received Earth's notification through the standard formal channel. It listed Daniel Reyes as Earth's new senior diplomatic representative to the Accord Council, with full credentials and standing equivalent to the highest-ranking diplomats of any member species. The notification requested formal confirmation of accreditation. The Accord confirmed within 6 hours. There was no negotiation. Several senior council members had, it turned out, been quietly prepared for some version of this possibility, and had ensured that the confirmation process would be frictionless. Councillor Drell, upon receiving the confirmation, wrote a short note to Councillor Veth. He came back on his own terms. Pay attention to the difference. Daniel arrived at Accord headquarters on a morning in early winter. He came without an escort and without ceremony. He had his credentials and his new insignia, Earth's emblem, not the Accord's, and he wore it on a uniform that was formal, but did not carry the decorations of his old operational rank. He had left all of that behind deliberately. He walked through the main corridor, and several people he knew, staff officers, administrative personnel, field commanders who happened to be at headquarters that week, saw him and stopped. A few approached him. He shook hands and said hello. He was warm and unhurried. Tan was there. She had returned from her remote posting 2 days earlier, called back by a transfer request that had been processed with unusual speed once certain people in the administration heard that Daniel was coming back. She was standing near the entrance to the staff section when he came through. and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has a great deal to say and is not going to say most of it. He stopped. "Ton," he said. "Commander," she said. Then she paused and looked at his new insignia. "Diplomat." "Daniel is fine," he said. She nodded. There was a silence between them that held a lot of things that neither of them needed to put into words. "The eastern grid is a mess," she said. "I know," he said. "I read the reports. It's going to take months to rebuild." "Probably," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Are you ready for that?" He thought about his kitchen, the bookshelf in the spare room, finished now, holding actual books, the walks, the sleep, the particular clarity of a person who has had enough space to understand what they want and why. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, the way someone nods when they believe you. He walked into the council chamber with his credentials and took the seat designated for Earth's senior diplomatic representative. It was a better seat than the one he had occupied before. He sat down and looked around the chamber. The same room, the same arrangement of 47 species, the same weight of history in the architecture. He looked at the table and remembered the small sound his old insignia had made when he set it down. He was not the same person who had set it down. He had not changed in any dramatic way. He was still calm, still patient, still the person who would listen all the way through before saying anything. But he had come back knowing something he had not known with the same clarity before. He had not come back because they needed him, though they did. He had not come back to prove something, though the proof was self-evident. He had come back because the work mattered, and because he had chosen it freely, and because those two things together made it worth doing. The armor fit differently now. Not heavier, not lighter. Just differently, the way something fits when you put it on because you want to, rather than because it has simply always been there. Sarah Vale was across the chamber. She looked at him when he sat down. He met her gaze without particular warmth and without hostility. She nodded once. He nodded back. That was enough for now. The session was called to order. The agenda was long, and the work was real, and there were problems in 12 sectors that needed attention. Daniel Reyes opened his tablet and got to work.